I'm Jim with Twisted Hobbies. Today, we're building the Madbull Max. Okay, today we're going to be building the Hacker Madbull Max. I'm really excited about this model because I love the Hacker Madbull, so I am looking forward to seeing how the Max version does. We have our power combo, which consists of our motor, our propeller, our ESC. We also have our servos, which I thought that I messed up and got the wrong servos, but this is right. We should have 3 of the D14s and 1 bigger one for the elevator. Then separate from the power combo, we have a receiver and we have my trusty foam tack, my favorite adhesive. One of the things I really enjoy about Hacker is inside the box, they always include a manual, which is awesome. But even though they do include a manual, I do go ahead and print one out in color because I like the color version a lot better. I'm glad they give it, but I wish it were color. Let's get into the build.
The first thing you may notice is there is a set of carbon fiber landing gear here. Those do not belong with this model. This model's gear is right here. But first, we empty out the box. I go through and verify all my parts are there. I'm going to fold over my surfaces for my ailerons and my rudder. My elevator doesn't have any folding because it's a fully floating elevator. Just be careful when you do this because on the ailerons, it is a profiled wing and you don't want to bend those too far. So I bent them, they're sitting to the side with some weight on them, and then we'll get started on our hinge reinforcements. We're going to cut this up into 10 pieces, and then we will start to lay out where they're going to go to get an idea of how much glue we're going to put on it. And the idea here is that if you just put the tape down, the tape will come right back off. It doesn't stick very well to the EPP. So if you prep it with a little bit of glue on the surface first, then it does a much better job of holding. So I just use foam tack and smear it around into the EPP a little, let it sit, and then come back and start putting each of the pieces of tape on. Make sure that you bend the surface all the way in the direction that it's going to go, so that way it doesn't bind the movement of the hinge. This is usually something that I forego altogether, but it's in the manual, so I did want to cover it, and there's probably no harm in adding some strength to the hinge. Next up, I'm going to grab a piece of parchment paper and we're going to glue these wings together. I spread some foam tack on, I press it together, and then I pull it apart for a minute. Once it starts to set, then I press it all the way together and then filled in any gaps in there. Then we're going to start onto the wing spars. There's one on top and bottom. And I'm going to be using my slot cutter here. I want this to be just below the surface of the foam. And I just use my straight edge. There's a handy little hole that shows you where to start and end on that, so that's really helpful. And I do sand and apply rubbing alcohol to each of the spars before I put them in, just to give them a little bit more to grip to. We place it in all the way across. I use a little flathead screwdriver to make sure it's shoved all the way down. And then we repeat the process on the other side. Once we're done with our wing spar, we're going to need to install our servos, but in order to do that, I want to make sure my servos are centered. So while I'm at it, let's also bind my receiver, calibrate the ESC, and verify motor direction. So there's a whole video in the description that shows that process all the way through. And now that that part's done, I need to make the extensions for the servo horns. So I get all my stuff ready for that. I cut those out. I collect my servo horns. And I had a hard time getting these servo horn extenders on. I tried reaming them out with an X-Acto blade. I also tried using a drill on them. Neither of those worked very well. It turns out that they're pliable enough that you can just pull them apart. and then they fit onto the servo horns just right. Then once those extenders are on, we're going to go back and put some thread on them and then hold the thread in place with some CA, and then I'll do just a little more CA around the edge. And then next we'll go ahead and install these extended servo horns onto the servos, and then we will glue the servos into the wing. The servo pockets don't have slots for the tabs on the servos, so what I like to do is press them into place. It kind of puts a little divot in there, and then that shows you where you need to just give it a little slice, and then they'll slide all the way in. And then once they're dry fit, you can glue them all the way in. Next up is going to be the aileron control horns. I do scuff these up just a little bit to give them some more grip. After the dry fit's done, they get glued in as well. Then we'll move on to the push rods for the ailerons. They have you bend the ends of these at 90 degrees, and then there's a clear plastic keeper that keeps them in place. Then we will install the clevises onto the push rods and the servo horns. There's a little brass pin that goes through there. Then I make sure the wing is neutral by using the X-Acto blades that are underneath there. They're propping it up, so that way it's in the neutral position. And then we'll use some CA glue. And then that will wrap up the work on the wing. Next up, we're starting on the full floating elevator. This is one of my favorite features of the Madbull Max. And first we're going to put some stiffeners into the horizontal fuselage. I just used some foam tack and put that in place. And then we're popping out all of the pieces. And then we use the manual to make sure that we are getting everything into the correct place. Now that the dry fit's done, we are ready to start gluing everything in place. So I do scuff these up a little bit, but I've never actually had any of these come out on their own, so I don't think it's necessary with the foam tack. But I start on the outside edges first and work my way in. And then we apply glue to the horizontal fuselage, and we really want to make sure that we don't get any glue on that area because it's going to spin through that part and it's going to be affixed out here on the edges. And I'm using CA glue to attach the carbon fiber tube to the elevator. Then we'll put some batteries on it to weigh it down while we're doing the next step. We're going to attach the horizontal fuselage to the tail piece. And then we're going to cut apart the vertical fuselage. You don't cut these tabs off, the tabs stay. You just cut between them. Then I lay the vertical fuselage on top of the horizontal fuselage, figure out where the glue is supposed to go, and then spread the glue out onto it. We get it nice and tight for the joint in there, and then make sure it is at 90 degrees. Then we're going to be working on our stiffeners for our fuselage, and space that out 22 millimeters from the end of the vertical fuselage. Then we can apply glue to our stiffeners and then put them in place. I also measured 90 degrees, making sure everything is staying square. Next up is going to be the reinforcements for the wing struts. And you're going to bend these to 90 degrees. Just make sure you're bending them in the correct direction because they are directional. You have to make sure you're putting the right one in the right place. And I'm just using a little foam tack to get those secured. Then we're going to be installing the wing. And we put a generous amount of glue into that joint, and I just make sure it's centered. There's a seam there to help you make sure it's centered. And then when we flip it over, there's some measurements to be done to make sure that everything is going to be square and you're not making your plane wonky. Then we'll get started on our wing struts. There's a few guides that we'll use, and those go directly in. And I just put foam tack for those. And I use a little pokey tool into the horizontal fuselage to get it going in there a little bit. Verify all of our measurements are set, and then I glue the bracing and use the thread that's supplied in order to really firm up that bracing. After wrapping it around a few times, I hit it with a couple drops of CA, and then those are set. Then we flip it over, I quadruple check all the measurements, and then I'm putting foam tack on all of those joints. And then measuring one final time to make sure everything is square. Next up, we're going to be working on the servos for the elevator and the rudder. And to help me run those wires, I just used a bent wire rod in order to grab a hold of the connector and pull it through. Then we'll glue those in place, and we'll put the motor mount in, but don't glue the motor mount yet. We'll do that down the road. Then we're going to work on our landing gear. And we're going to measure and cut a couple pieces of carbon fiber. And while we're at it, I think I'm just going to cut all of them that I need to get cut. You'll also see here that I'm just using some little diagonal cutters to make these cuts. You can use a cutoff wheel, or you could put it down and use an X-Acto blade and kind of roll it back and forth. Both of those make a mess, so I just like to snip them with the diagonal cutters. It does kind of squish the ends of them a little bit, but since we're already going to be sanding those, it's not too big a deal. I sharpened up the ends of those two pieces that go into the landing gear area. Gotta get them really sharp so they're able to pierce the EPP, and then we can put glue in that whole area and glue it all together. Here I'm cutting a slot for the tail skid and gluing it into place. And now we're going to dry fit the lower half of the vertical fuselage. You'll see that there is some cutouts I got to do for the servos because they weren't quite clearing it in that area. So make sure that those are nice and clear. And then we'll add foam tack and press it together. And then you'll see me using the square to make sure everything is at 90 degrees and perpendicular. And then we're moving on to the motor mount reinforcement areas. And this is also the place to make sure you're gluing in the motor mount as well. I skipped this step and came back to it later. Now we're moving on to the supports for the lower fuselage and the gear. They go from the wing struts all the way down. And I'm just using a little pokey tool to make a little pilot hole, and then I'm able to glue in the carbon fiber rods. We're going to check that everything is square, and then we'll put some CA in to the lower mount. Then we'll add one small diagonal brace on the underside of the fuselage. And then we're moving on to push rods. So I pop out all my push rod guides, I find my clevises, and I'm going to glue the clevises on the end, load all my guides onto the push rod. We glue the rudder control horn in place, and then we put on the clevises for the elevator and rudder, and then we're able to install the push rods. I install the clevis onto the servo horn, Then I install all of the push rod guides. I cut off the push rod at the appropriate length, and you want to make sure that measurement is just right because there is no manual adjustment for your push rod length once you get it set. Now we're ready to glue the elevator control horn onto the carbon fiber tube. And then I will install the vertical stabilizer and rudder and push rod for the rudder as well. I held these together as the glue dried because if you let it rest on the table, it will pull back apart. I propped it up with a little battery, and now we're able to cut the push rod to length, install the push rod guides, and then glue the push rod into the clevis. Now we're on to doing the wheels. We pop them out, press the pieces together, add some glue, press together a little more. Then we'll attach the tires to the hubs. And I apply foam tack between the two tires. Just don't go overboard because if it squeezes out, it's a little unsightly. A little bit of CA around the rim of those. And then we're ready to install. There's a little hub keeper. And then those get glued into place. Okay, our landing gear's all done. We're ready to start installing electronics. I'm using a piece of wire. It's an old push rod from another build, and I'm tucking in the wiring. I do this for a while. I installed the motor with the ESC on top of the fuselage here. That was a bad idea. Later on I went back and changed it all up, put the ESC down below where it belongs. Here we're checking for CG. This is where the battery ended up being placed. And let's balance the prop. And get the prop installed. And now we are all finished with the build. Okay, for the maiden flight, I am super excited because the Madbull is one of my favorite models, so the Madbull Max, I have very high hopes for it. I'm using a 3S 720 milliamp hour battery. I also use an 850. Both of those seem to be working just fine. So it's a little breezy today, not terrible, but enough that the plane does move a little bit back towards us during a hover, but it hovers perfectly. I forgot to do any trimming on it, although I don't think it needed it because we built it pretty straight with everything pretty neutral. You see that first spin I tried to do there. I overcorrected because it's got so much elevator authority that you really need to get used to how much it has available. So pulling it all the way usually works on some models, but on this one it might be too much because it really acts like a brake. So it is really loving the spins and tumbles, and it does a great job in knife edge. Usually they try to roll out of knife edge and want to go back to level because of the high wing. But this one seems very balanced, so I'm really digging it. For a 41-inch plane, it's very light and floaty. The power combo that came with it is perfectly matched. Got to have some good powerful servos to throw such big ailerons around, and the ones that came with it were matched really well. It's not quite as short coupled as the original Madbull, but it still really loves its flips, loops, and spins because of its elevator being a full floating. It really likes to push itself around the wing. This is my first knife edge spin with it, and it falls so slowly, and then in its funnel hover, it could stay in a funnel hover as long as you keep it there. Overall, I would say that this is a incredibly fun plane to fly. It's really playful and kind of springy in its abilities. I think because it really whips around the tail so quickly, and you're able to do fun things like touch and goes in the grass, in the sand, it doesn't matter. I can't do that with many other of my foamies because the landing gear will get caught and the wheels, they don't like landing on grass, but this one's great. Inverted, it felt real smooth. I probably have to do a little CG adjustment because you see me doing some porpoising here, but I just moved the battery back a tiny bit, gave it a little trim, and that fixed it right up. As far as how this compares to the original Madbull, I think that Hacker Models did an excellent job at keeping what's so special about it while scaling everything up and making it a faster, more capable plane. This has become my favorite of this size. It's fantastic to have a fully capable high-wing 3D outdoor plane. Here's a bit of a sloppy pinwheel, so you can see how the rudder is able to really have a lot of control. And then a flat spin that just keeps floating down and even starts climbing up if you're not careful. The landing gear on it is great. It can take some abuse. One thing I forgot to show on this flight was the flaps. I do have it programmed so I have it on a slider and can adjust the flaps both directions, but I did forget to show it here. It doesn't have any bad tendencies when flying inverted. It seems to take it really well, really likes the inverted Harrier. Since this maiden flight, I think I've done about 30 more flights on it, and I do have other high wing foamies, but this one is definitely my favorite. I'm looking forward to a lot more flights with it, and it's fun to have a new go-to. I hope you enjoyed the build video, and I hope you enjoy your Madbull Max as much as I do.